The title of this lesson is The Age of European Exploration. Its major points include, more specifically, exploration and settlement by the Spanish and the Columbian Exchange. Please consult Canvas for relevant text references for this lesson. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to examine the factors that gave rise to the era of exploration and colonization in Europe, define mercantilism, discuss Spain's impact on New World colonization, identify the origins of the transatlantic slave trade, define the Columbian Exchange, and its cultural and biological impact on the world. Let's begin. In order to better appreciate why exploration and eventual colonization happens in the first place, it's important to review some significant developments that occurred on the European continent at roughly the same time. With respect to the first of these two changes, the Renaissance, this phenomena opened a whole new world for a population that for the better part of 1,000 years had their lives more or less dictated in every way by the Roman Catholic Church. A French term literally meaning rebirth, the Renaissance represented a time of economic renewal and a reinvigorated interest in the arts across Europe. At about the same time, an important movement known as the Protestant Reformation further loosened the Catholic Church's grip on the intellectual, social, and political life of Europe. Started by a German cleric named Martin Luther, the Reformation was a movement built on the premise that all should be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, and they did not need the intervention of priests or popes to have a relationship with God. The wholesale questioning of church authority that the Reformation inspired sparked intellectual curiosity that would make interest in exploration possible. From a political standpoint, Europe was organizing itself into a continent that was beginning to feature nation-states. Just as the Roman Catholic Church had once held a monopoly on intellectual pursuits before the Renaissance, it also had a lock on political organization as well. This situation changes when land-owning nobles from across the continent began to consolidate their property holdings and interests to form modern countries with familiar names: France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Finally, the economy was changing in the 1500s. Europeans moved further and further away from better arrangements and more towards the use of hard currencies backed by precious metals such as gold and silver. This would bring on intense competition for power between the newly formed nation-states that exploration and colonization would define. In addition to all of the other factors described on the previous slide, there was also the Marco Polo factor. And no, we're not talking about the childhood swimming pool game. In the 1300s, Italian adventurer Marco Polo wrote The Adventures of Marco Polo, in which he chronicled his 25-year journey through Far East Asia. The tales of his exploits helped spark vigorous trade between Italy and such far eastern provinces as the Spice Islands, India, and China. This trade made an elite class of Italian merchants very wealthy and invited the envy of other European states wanting a trading relationship of their own because of all the riches such a trade promised to add to their treasuries. Though written in the 1300s, it wasn't until the 1455 invention of the movable type printing press that dramatically heightened the impact of Polo's work across Europe. The printing press made published materials less expensive and therefore more accessible to the general public. When Europeans read about the lifestyles that Far East Asian goods provided, those who acquired them, i.e., fine fabrics, exotic food spices, jewels, and precious metals, they began to envy the wealth of these Italian merchants and wondered how they could establish trading relationships of their own. This leads us to a discussion about the national economic policy known as mercantilism. This national economic policy was designed to maximize the trade of a nation and the accumulation of gold and silver. The emergence of mercantilism as the driving force behind exploration and colonization becomes more apparent as we get into the 15th century. Against this backdrop, the scene will be set for the Iberian Peninsula to take center stage in exploration and settlement. What other European countries envied was the wealth that Italy had gained from its lucrative trade in spices, exotic fabrics, and precious metals from East Asia. Western European countries all over began to ask the ever important question, how can we get a piece of that action? So the first thing that had to be found was an all-water route to Asia. And the very first country to venture outside of Europe to find such a highly desirable all-water trade route was Portugal. Portugal had established a reputation for navigation as seafaring Portuguese were among the first Western Europeaners to sail and explore the sub-Saharan reaches of Africa. Thus, historians recognize them for establishing the transatlantic slave trade. What initially started out as coastal trading posts turned into outposts where enslaved captives were traded for gold, which were in turn traded for more enslaved captives. In order to get in on the Asian trading action, the countries of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, desired to find an all-water trade route to Asia. Why an all-water route? Well, this map that is being shown here provides a bit of a clue. This map shows the much sought after water route to Asia that the Portuguese were successful in establishing through the voyages of Vasco da Gama. So we learned and pretty much had established that we can get to Asia sailing east from Europe, but what happens if we sail west? Portugal's next-door neighbor, Spain, watched with envy as Portugal built its wealth and its treasury by these sailing expeditions. The Spanish began to wonder whether or not there could be an all-water route to Asia going to the west, and this is where our good friend Christopher Columbus enters into the picture. Portugal's Christopher Columbus was of Italian birth and tried to offer his services to the Italian government first, but they refused to give him money and the provisions that he was asking for. So he took his proposal to the Spanish government, who offered to pay him handsomely if he could find an all-water western route to Asia. Though Columbus is hailed for his genius, his could quite possibly go down as one of history's greatest accidents. He was, after all, seeking an all-water route to Asia, but what he found instead was a huge landmass that blocked this all-oceanic journey. As it happened, Spain would be uniquely positioned to fashion new lands into their own image of dependent and economically contributing colonies because of events that had transpired in its own recent past. In an event known as the Reconquista, the Spanish had to regain control of its government after having lost it for a period of 500 years to Muslim Moor invaders that had ruled it from the 8th through 13th centuries. Their incidental contact with the native inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere must have certainly reminded them of experiences dealing with non-Spanish people they regarded as inferior, and the writings of the earliest Spanish explorers reflect some of these attitudes. Spain put in place an elaborate and comprehensive administrative infrastructure that provided strict governance of its colonial possessions, though their main government was located thousands of miles away. The tight administrative control given by way of the Council of Indies would offer a stark contrast to the loosely governed controlled structures later put in place by the British, as we will see in a future lesson. This diagram shows the structure of the Council of Indies and how government was administered in practice, and how they administered Spain's American colonies. As it says here on the diagram, each principality was further subdivided into smaller administrative units administered by viceroys. And all of these entities directly reported to the Spanish crown. So again, this is going to represent a stark contrast in the way American colonies would be governed when compared to their English counterparts. Now, what Columbus's air quote discovery also brought was a phenomena known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is what is referred to when humans and matter from both sides of the globe came into contact with one another. As the map or the diagram you are looking at shows, there were definite things that were exchanged or introduced to the so-called New World from the so-called Old World of Europe and Africa. And among those things that were exchanged included various forms of plant and animal life, diseases, foodstuffs, ways of doing things, culture, and the same could be said for what the New World introduced to the Old World. Now, a couple of things that aren't mentioned or aren't shown on the map are diseases. From the Old World to the New World, diseases such as smallpox was introduced to indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere. And from the Americas to Europe and Africa, a disease known as syphilis was introduced to inhabitants of those parts of the world. So this tells us a little bit, or gives us a little bit of insight into what kinds of things were being exchanged when inhabitants from these different areas of the world came into contact with each other. Aside from a robust way in which the Spanish crown governed its colonies, it also had a robust military presence. There was a class of colonial warriors that were collectively known as the conquistadors, who were very instrumental in helping Spain to establish an extensive presence in the New World. They were known for the routinely brutal tactics that they employed against the native dwellers they came into contact with, and the violence that they used in an attempt to either enslave and or Christianize them. Among some of the most notable included men like Hernan Cortez, who was associated with the decline of the Aztec Empire. Then there was Francisco Pizarro, who is associated with the destruction of Peru's Incan Empire. Finally, there's the name of one more closely associated to us here at home, that is Juan Ponce de Leon. Leon came to near where Puerto Vedra Beach is now during the Easter weekend of 1513. Because of the native flora that he saw that was at its most spectacular, at the time that he made his land sighting, he named the area he surveyed La Florida, which means land full of flowers. Leon and his crew would spend the better part of the year exploring Florida's interior in search of gold, and in search of a mythical city told to him by the natives of the land known as Cibola, which in Spanish meant city of gold. Included in Leon's expeditionary team was a man of color who the record identifies only as Esteban. Esteban is said to have had a gift for linguistic interpretation, and so is believed to be very valuable to Leon's team. Not much is written about Esteban after his travels with Leon, and it is believed that he may have married into a local Native American tribe eventually. Now, not everyone agreed with the tactics of the conquistadors. One very vocal voice of dissent was Bartolomeu de las Casas. In 1552, de las Casas wrote an impassioned essay entitled The Destruction of the Indies, in which he was among one of the first Europeans to argue for the humanity of the Native Americans. De las Casas objected to the genocidal practices of the conquistadors in their pursuit of land and gold, and most strenuously objected to their enslavement. What is interesting here is though he objected to the enslavement of Native Americans, de las Casas in that same essay endorsed the idea of enslaving Africans. It was, however, an idea that he would, to his credit, later reject. By 1530, the efforts of these conquerors gave Spain immense holdings in the New World. Spain became the prominent European power in the Americas. By 1590, Spain's era of dominance in the New World would come to an end. Why? How did Spain lose its footing in North America? And why don't we know more about the Spanish heritage of this country? Well, I list some reasons for that here. North American settlement is confined to, or would be eventually confined, to the southwest and to the extreme southeast. There has always been somewhat of a historic northeast coast bias in the crafting and writing of American history. Also, Spanish people were more willing to engage in interracial or inter-ethnic relationships and encounters with Native Americans, whereas English Americans had more restrictions on the practice of interracial sex and marriage. Finally, I believe that at the end of the day, English hegemony won out. What is hegemony anyway? Hegemony means the cultural influence that one culture has over the other. And we see this in terms of the languages that are spoken, the legal customs that are adopted, the religious traditions that are practiced. In all of these measures, English hegemony won out. Again, hegemony refers to the cultural characteristics that influence the cultural behavior of another society. So, in other words, what is the language that we speak predominantly in the United States today? Our legal traditions are based on Old English legal traditions. We are primarily a Protestant nation, or at least have been historically, versus a predominantly Catholic nation, unlike what 75% of the Western Hemisphere is. Now, again, in a future lesson, we'll explore why English hegemony would become the dominant cultural force in the shaping of what would later go on to be known as the United States. So this concludes Lesson 2. Please refer to Canvas for relevant text references.